Lake Michigan is the third largest of the Great Lakes by surface area and the second largest by volume. Lake Michigan is also the only Great Lake that is entirely within the United States. But Lake Michigan is also the deadliest Great Lake in terms of drownings. Every year, nearly half of all people who drown in the Great Lakes drown on Lake Michigan, mainly because of its interesting geography that creates dangerous rip currents near the shore and massive waves that can appear out of nowhere and hit one after another, especially near beaches. But Lake Michigan is also one of the deadliest Great Lakes in terms of shipwrecks as well. Here are 5 shipwrecks that were lost with all hands on Lake Michigan. On October 26, 1892, the relatively new freighter W.H. Gilcher departed Buffalo, New York with a load of 3,080 tons of coal bound for Milwaukee, but little did anybody know, the W.H. Gilcher would never make it to her destination. Labeled Hull Number 10, the W.H. Gilcher was constructed in 1890 by the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company for 3 Ohio lumber merchants. She was nearly identical to another ship being built nearby, the Western Reserve, which was also being constructed for those 3 men. I have a video about the Western Reserve if you want to learn more. The W.H. Gilcher and her sister ship were some of the first lake freighters with steel hulls rather than iron or wood. The W.H. Gilcher was launched on December 10, 1890, and entered service in March of 1891. She came in at 2,414 gross tons and measured 302 feet or 92 meters in length. For the next 2 years, the W.H. Gilcher and her sister ship transported various raw materials throughout the Great Lakes, and her brief career was mostly uneventful. On October 26, 1892, the Gilcher, under the command of Captain Leeds Weeks, departed Buffalo, New York bound for Milwaukee with a load of 3,080 tons of coal. The weather was calm for the first half of the voyage, but after she passed through the Straits of Mackinac and entered Lake Michigan on October 28th, a massive storm swept over the lake. When the storm cleared on October 30th, several ships arrived in port behind schedule. But the W.H. Gilcher never arrived in Milwaukee. On the evening of October 28th, the captain of a nearby schooner claimed to have seen a vessel matching the W.H. Gilcher fighting her way through the storm in northern Lake Michigan. A few weeks after her disappearance, several passing ships found debris from the Gilcher, and a few bodies of the ship's crew were found washed ashore. But as of the making of this video, the wreck of the W.H. Gilcher remains undiscovered. On November 22, 1912, the nearly 45-year-old schooner Rouse Simmons departed Thompson, Michigan with a load of 5,000 Christmas trees bound for the churches and orphanages of Chicago. Unfortunately, a November gale soon swept over Lake Michigan, and the aging schooner disappeared with all hands in the storm, not to be discovered until nearly 6 decades later. The Rouse Simmons was constructed in 1868 by the Allen, McClellan & Company shipyard in Milwaukee and was launched on August 27, 1868. Named after a prominent Kenosha businessman, the Rouse Simmons came in at 205 gross tons and measured 124 feet or 37 meters in length. She was a wooden-hulled, 3-masted schooner designed to transport lumber between Chicago and various ports on Lake Michigan. In 1870, the vessel was purchased by lumber magnate Charles Hackley, and she would make almost weekly trips transporting lumber between Grand Haven, Michigan, and Chicago. However, by the 1890s, there was a growing popularity of decorating pine or evergreen trees for Christmas in the United States. So during the holiday season, the Simmons would also transport Christmas trees to Chicago, where people could go on board the vessel and choose a tree. And the vessel continued to do so for the next 20 years. On November 22, 1912, the Rouse Simmons was loaded with approximately 5,000 evergreen trees in Thompson, Michigan, bound for the churches and orphanages of Chicago. However, as soon as she left port, a November gale began building over Lake Michigan, and that same storm sank 3 other ships as well. At roughly 3 p.m. the next day, a vessel that was believed to be the Simmons was spotted by a local life-saving station, with a distress flag hoisted. A life-saving boat was deployed to reach the schooner, but the bad weather prevented them from reaching the ship, and the vessel soon disappeared into the storm. It's still unknown as to whether the ship was the Simmons or not, but it's unlikely that whatever ship it was survived the storm. A few days later, the Simmons was reported overdue in arriving in Chicago. Upon hearing the news, the family of the ship's captain, Herman Schuneman, knew that the ship had been lost in the storm. Over the next few months, the remains of Christmas trees washed ashore on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. In honor of the Simmons and her crew, the following year, 1913, a large Christmas tree was erected on the lakefront in Chicago. Over 100,000 people attended. Other schooners continued delivering Christmas trees to Chicago during the holiday season for the next decade or so, but due to the age of the ships, they were deemed unsafe to sail on, and they were quickly pulled from service and scrapped. and this essentially diminished the practice of Christmas tree ships until 2000 when the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac docked at Chicago's Navy Pier to deliver thousands of Christmas trees to the city, both in honor of the Rouse Simmons and to keep the tradition alive, which they still do to this day. The wreck of the Rouse Simmons was discovered in 1971 sitting upright in roughly 170 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Most of the ship's hull is still intact, and the remains of her cargo of Christmas trees can still be found in her holds. Even today, the cause of her sinking remains a mystery, and her story is mostly forgotten, but still lives in the memory of many Chicago residents to this day. In late October of 1929, around the same time that the stock market crash plunged the United States into the Great Depression, 3 ships met their end on Lake Michigan. On October 29th, the 204-foot iron-hulled package freighter Wisconsin was sailing from Chicago bound for Milwaukee when she sprang a leak in a storm and sank with a loss of 9 out of the 68 people on board. Just 2 days later, on Halloween, the 410-foot freighter Senator collided with the steamer Marquette in heavy fog, around 20 miles northeast of Port Washington, Wisconsin. Out of the 28 people on board, 9 lost their lives. But just a few days before these 2 ships went down, the car ferry Milwaukee went down in a storm on Lake Michigan after departing her namesake port. All 46 people on board lost their lives. Labeled hull number 413, the vessel was constructed in 1902 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern Railroad Company based in Manistee, Michigan. At the time of her construction, car ferries were becoming vital for railroad companies on the Great Lakes. These are not the types of car ferries that transport people and their automobiles across a short stretch of water. These types of car ferries were designed to carry railroad cars and occasionally passengers across the Great Lakes. These ships had several railroad tracks inside that would allow the cars to be loaded onto the ship through the stern. And after reaching their destination on the other side of the lake, they would be offloaded and continue their trip. Car ferries were also designed to sail as late into the season as possible, meaning that they had to have reinforced hulls, and their engines had to produce more power than the underpowered lake freighters. The Milwaukee was one of those car ferries. When she was launched on December 6, 1902, she was originally named the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern No. 1. She came in at 2,933 gross tons and measured 388 feet or 118 meters in length. In 1909, the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern No. 1 was sold to the Grand Trunk Milwaukee Car Ferry Company and was renamed Milwaukee, and for the next 2 decades, she enjoyed a relatively uneventful career. But that all changed on October 22, 1929, when the Milwaukee, under the command of Captain Robert McKay, departed her namesake port with a load of 25 railroad cars bound for Grand Haven, Michigan. However, before the ship even left port, Lake Michigan was being overtaken by a massive storm. Despite this, Captain McKay, who was known as a heavy weather captain, decided to leave port nonetheless, eager to keep on schedule. Several other ships decided to stay in port and wait out the storm, knowing that the storm was more than they could handle. As the Milwaukee reached the open lake, she battled gale-force winds and massive waves. At around 3:45 p.m., the ferry was spotted by the U.S. Lightship No. 95, around 3 miles east of the port of Milwaukee. The crew of the lightship saw the ferry pitching and rolling heavily in the storm, and massive waves crashed over her deck. The crew of the lightship saw the ferry being tossed about in the storm for around 10 minutes before she vanished into the heavy rain and fog. But little did anybody know, this would be the last time anyone would see the Milwaukee for over 4 decades. When the Milwaukee failed to arrive in Grand Haven, Michigan when the storm cleared, there wasn't much concern since travel delays and storms were common. It wasn't until 36 hours after the Milwaukee was due to arrive in Grand Haven that a search was organized to find any traces of the ship. On October 24th, a rescue plane was sent out to search the area in which the ship was supposed to sail through, but they didn't find any traces of the ship or her crew. But soon, debris from the ship and bodies of the ship's crew washed ashore. Just north of Racine, Wisconsin, 4 men were discovered near the shore, 2 of them wearing life jackets bearing the words Milwaukee. On October 26, a lifeboat from the Milwaukee was found near Holland, Michigan with the bodies of 4 of her crew members. But then, the next day, October 27th, a message box from the Milwaukee was discovered on a beach near Grand Haven. Inside was a rolled-up message from one of the ship's pursers. The message read, SS Milwaukee, October 22nd, 1929. The ship is making water fast. We have turned around and headed for Milwaukee. Pumps are working, but Seagate is bent and can't keep water out. Flicker is flooded. Seas are tremendous. Things look bad. Crew roll is about the same as last payday. It was signed A.R. Sadin, purser. It was confirmed that it was the handwriting of the Milwaukee's purser, Albine R. Sadin. His body was discovered a few days before his message washed ashore. None of the estimated 52 people on board the Milwaukee survived the sinking, and only 15 bodies of the ship's victims were recovered. One of the bodies recovered was wearing a watch that stopped at 9:35 p.m., suggesting that it was around the time the ship began her final plunge. Following the disaster, an investigation was held to figure out what caused the ship to sink. Some speculate that the ship's owners forced Captain McKay to make the dangerous run, despite the heavy weather. However, the company quickly refuted these claims by saying that they had provided weather reports to their other captains in Milwaukee at the time, and all their other ships remained in port when the storm hit. On top of that, in the summer of 1929, the Milwaukee passed all her physical inspections and was believed to be perfectly sound. In the end, it was concluded that the ship was simply overwhelmed by the force of the storm. The wreck of the Milwaukee was discovered in 1972 in roughly 125 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Michigan. She lies only 3 miles from her point of departure. After further examination of the wreck, it was found that during the storm, the ship's sea gate had been damaged, which allowed tons of water to freely enter the ship. But in the end, the sinking of the Milwaukee remains one of the deadliest carfare disasters on the Great Lakes. On November 11, 1940, two huge storm systems merged over the Great Lakes, creating a massive gale that covered thousands of square miles. Lake Michigan experienced the worst of the storm. 2 fishing tugs and 3 massive freighters went down on Lake Michigan in the storm. Approximately 66 sailors lost their lives in the storm. Often referred to as the Armistice Day storm, it was one of the deadliest storms in the history of the Great Lakes. The Canadian freighter Anna C. Minch was one of the several freighters claimed by Lake Michigan during the storm. Labeled hull number 415, the Anna C. Minch was constructed in 1903 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Kinsman Transit Company, based in Cleveland, and was launched on April 18, 1903. She came in at 4,285 gross tons and measured 380 feet or 120 meters in length. However, over her nearly 4-decade-long career, she suffered more than a dozen groundings and collisions. On December 4, 1925, while carrying a load of coal, she became stranded at Fox Point on Lake Michigan. But after she was released by tugs the next day, she began taking on water, but the flooding was contained. In September of 1926, the Minch was sold to the Western Navigation Company based in Fort William, Ontario, and for the next 14 years, her career was relatively uneventful. On November 11, 1940, the Anna C. Minch, under the command of 55-year-old Captain Donald Kennedy, departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of grain bound for Chicago. The weather was calm as she sailed through the Straits of Mackinac, but soon, the storm system that had just passed over Chicago made its way into Lake Michigan. But to the crew of the Anna C. Minch, the storm was no cause for concern. However, the storm quickly intensified as blinding snow and 80-mile-per-hour winds swept over Lake Michigan. Many ships on Lake Michigan were caught off guard as they battled 20 to 30-foot waves as they fought their way through the storm. The Anna C. Minch found herself in a struggle for survival. Sometime that night, as the ship fought her way through the storm, the Minch broke in two, giving her crew only moments to escape. Not a single one of her 24 crew members survived, but the Anna C. Minch was not the only ship claimed by Lake Michigan that night. On November 11, 1940, the freighter William B. Davock was running a few hours ahead of the Anna C. Minch. Labeled hull number 26, the ship was constructed in 1907 by the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in St. Clair, Michigan for the Vulcan Steamship Company. The ship was launched on September 25, 1907, and entered service a few weeks later. She was a decent size for her time, coming in at 4,468 gross tons and measured 420 feet or 130 meters in length. She was operated by a crew of 32. She was designed to carry iron ore from Lake Superior to Lake Erie and Lake Michigan and return with a cargo of coal. In October of 1915, the Davock was sold to the Interlake Steamship Company, and in the winter of 1922, the freighter underwent a major overhaul, which reduced her tonnage to 4,220 gross tons. Aside from that, her 3-decade-long career was relatively uneventful. On November 11, 1940, the Davock, under the command of Captain Charles Allen, was carrying a cargo of coal from Erie, Pennsylvania to Chicago. That afternoon, Captain Allen sent a message from the ship's radio telephone reporting the ship's position and mentioning that the weather was calm. But soon, Captain Allen and his ship would find themselves in a struggle for survival. Soon, the William B. Davock battled her way through 80-mile-per-hour winds and monstrous waves that repeatedly broke over her deck. As the ship lifted and fell in the waves, her propeller kept rising out of the water, which forced her crew to reduce power to prevent overspinning. But Captain Allen held out hope that his ship could survive the storm. But soon, as the ship fought her way through the maelstrom, her rudder abruptly turned hard to port and stopped responding to the wheel, causing the ship to suddenly veer to the side. Not long afterward, the rudder smashed into the propeller, and a huge vibration was felt throughout the ship, and she soon fell into a trough. By that point, her fate was sealed. The freighter rolled over and disappeared beneath the surface, taking all 32 of her crew with her. Her wreck was discovered in May of 1972, not far from the Anna C. Minch. The state of both wrecks offers some clues about what happened to both freighters in their final moments, but without any survivors, it is impossible to know for sure. Unfortunately, the Anna C. Minch and the William B. Davock were not the only freighters claimed by the storm. The Canadian freighter Davock was also fighting her way through the storm not far from both freighters. For a moment, Captain Stipe of the Davock spotted the NSC Minch before she vanished in the whiteout conditions. While battling her way through the storm, the Davock was never able to generate the power needed to maintain headway. Captain Stipe knew that his ship was sailing dangerously close to shore, and sometime that night, the Davock beached around 150 yards offshore, around 2 miles north of Little Point Sable. 2 crew tried to cross her open deck, but a massive wave swept over the ship, and they were swept away. But soon, the 17 survivors were rescued. Unfortunately, it was impossible for the Davock to be salvaged, and she remained on the beach until she was ripped apart by the punishing surf. In the end, 154 people lost their lives in the Armistice Day storm, including 66 sailors. To this day, it remains one of the deadliest storms in the history of the Great Lakes. In addition to the 5 shipwrecks we just covered, it's said that Lake Michigan has its own Bermuda Triangle. The Lake Michigan Triangle stretches between Manitowoc, Wisconsin, Ludington, and Benton Harbor, Michigan, and has had an unusual amount of disappearances. Numerous steel-hulled steamers, schooners, and aircraft have gone missing in the triangle since the 17th century. In fact, the very first shipwreck on the Great Lakes, the bark Le Griffon, designed by René Robert Cavier Sieur de La Salle, one of the first to explore the Great Lakes region, disappeared on Lake Michigan in September of 1679 after leaving Washington Island. On October 30th, 1921, the more than 50-year-old schooner Rosabelle departed High Island on northern Lake Michigan, bound for Benton Harbor with a load of potatoes and lumber, when a heavy fog bank descended over Lake Michigan. The next day, on Halloween, the car ferry Ann Arbor No. 4 came across the wreck of the Rosabelle, drifting around 15 miles off the coast of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Her crew was nowhere to be found, and her stern was heavily damaged. At first, it was thought that the damage was the result of a collision, but no other ship on the lake reported any collision. Soon, a steamer came to tow the ship to Racine, where she was beached to be salvaged. Even after several examinations of the wreck, it was unclear what caused the damage to the ship. No bodies of the ship's crew were ever found, and the wreck of the Rosabelle was eventually scrapped. And then, on June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was flying from New York City to Seattle when she vanished over Lake Michigan with 58 people on board. But these are just a handful of the many unusual mysteries of the Lake Michigan Triangle, and we may never know the full stories of the sailors who lost their lives in the area. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss any new uploads from this channel. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.